The courtroom was alive with murmurs, casual chatter, and the kind of low laughter that signals something more sinister than amusement. It wasn't just a reaction to a case, it was directed at a man. A black man, standing quietly at the front, hands calmly at his sides, wearing a plain shirt and slacks, no flashy suit, no entourage, nothing to mark him as important. He wasn't speaking, but he was being spoken about. The smirks, the subtle gestures, the exchanged glances were all aimed at him, rooted not in any facts of the case but in something far more instinctive, judgment based on appearance alone. The officers posted along the walls weren't exactly hiding their dismissive body language. A few leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, eyes bored or mildly entertained. One even chuckled under his breath, nudging the officer beside him. They didn't know his name. They didn't ask. All they saw was a black man standing before a judge. And that was all they thought they needed to know. In moments like these, the justice system reveals its fractures, not through its rulings or procedures, but in the unspoken assumptions that trail every step of a person walking into court. It wasn't about what the man had done or not done. The laughter wasn't rooted in any specific charge or detail of the case. It was rooted in something deeper and uglier, an automatic belief that if a black man was standing in that position, he must be guilty, or at least deserving of mockery. The robes, the badges, the architecture of the courtroom, all symbols of supposed fairness, seemed to warp in that moment into instruments of subtle prejudice. The laughter wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the air like humidity, hard to point at but easy to feel. Every person who snickered or smirked made a silent decision that they had the right to judge this man before hearing anything about him. And this is where racial profiling reveals its most dangerous form, not on the streets alone, but within institutions where impartiality is supposed to be sacred. The courtroom should have been a space of truth, of measured evaluation, of justice blind to race, class, or status. Instead, it became a stage for assumptions. The color of the man's skin was being read as evidence. His posture, his clothing, his quiet demeanor, all filtered through a lens of bias that had nothing to do with facts. He was being profiled not because of anything he had done, but because of who he appeared to be. And this kind of profiling isn't always loud or obvious. It hides behind smirks, behind the tapping of a pen, behind the barely noticeable roll of an eye. It's insidious precisely because it's often unspoken, shared as a silent agreement between those who believe they're in on something. When racial profiling steps into a courtroom, it doesn't just affect one case. It corrodes the credibility of the entire legal system. It suggests that justice is not a principle but a performance, where the outcome may be influenced more by skin tone than by truth. The man standing in front of them wasn't being seen. He was being reduced, turned into a symbol, a caricature, a punchline. That courtroom wasn't just a place of law that day. It became a mirror reflecting how deep prejudice can run even in places designed to rise above it. But what those in the courtroom didn't know, what none of them even bothered to imagine, was that the man standing before them had given his life to defending the very Constitution they claimed to uphold. They didn't know about the years he spent in service, the battles he'd fought, the lives he'd led, or the honors he'd earned. None of it mattered to them in that moment because racial profiling doesn't wait for information. It jumps to conclusions. It laughs before it listens. And that's what makes it so dangerous. It assumes guilt where there is none. It assumes inferiority where there is excellence. And it assumes comedy where there should be respect. This moment in the courtroom was not unique. It plays out in courtrooms across the country every day in subtle, quiet ways. Each smirk, each joke, each dismissive glance adds to a culture that tells black individuals they will be judged before they speak, that they must prove their worth where others are assumed to have it. It is a culture that strips dignity not with slurs, but with smiles. The courtroom had become a place where racial profiling wasn't just tolerated, it was unchallenged. It was woven into the silence between words, into the body language of authority figures, into the barely masked contempt that hung in the air. The man stood there, silent, composed, and fully aware of the dozens of eyes trained on him, not with curiosity, but with contempt. He had entered the courtroom without making a scene, without raising his voice, without demanding attention. But still, attention had found him. Not because of anything he said, not because of anything he did, but because of how he looked. A black man, alone, facing the justice system with nothing but his name, his record, and his presence. Yet that presence was being dissected in real time, not by facts or merits, but by assumptions. He didn't wear an expensive suit. He didn't carry the air of someone with social clout or political pull. He looked, to the casual observer, ordinary. And in a room charged with bias, ordinary became synonymous with less than. Misjudgment based on appearance is not always loud. It doesn't need to be. Sometimes it comes in the form of glances that flick away quickly when returned. Sometimes it's in the tone of a clerk's voice, suddenly short, suddenly dismissive. It hides behind procedural formality, masking deeper prejudice beneath the practiced rhythm of legal protocol. It thrives in subtlety, because subtlety gives it cover. No one had to say the words aloud, no one had to call him names or question his dignity directly. Their posture did it for them. Their tone. Their amused looks. The people in that courtroom had already decided who he was. Not because of evidence. Not because of any testimony. But because of the story they wrote in their heads the moment they saw him. This is the kind of misjudgment that robs people of their humanity before they even open their mouths. It isn't just about race, though race plays a central role. It's about the assumptions people carry into rooms of power, especially rooms designed to decide a person's fate. In these rooms, appearance becomes a shortcut for character. And that shortcut often leads to injustice. The man's skin color, his clothes, even his silence were read as signs of guilt or incompetence. They were mistaken for weakness. For lack of status. For lack of power. But what they failed to see was the strength it takes to walk into a room like that and still hold your head up. This misjudgment reveals more about the people making it than the one being judged. It exposes how deeply embedded our cultural biases are, even among those who claim impartiality. It shows how little we've learned about dignity, how quickly we equate a polished suit with respectability, and a quiet, humble demeanor with irrelevance. In that courtroom, they were blind not because they couldn't see, but because they refused to look past the surface. They had the information in front of them, but they chose the shortcut instead. They judged the book not just by its cover, but by the assumptions they'd always carried about what certain covers mean. There's a cost to that kind of misjudgment. A cost not just to the individual being dismissed, but to the system itself. When people in positions of power allow appearance to guide their thinking, they betray the very principles they are meant to uphold. They turn justice into theater. And worse, they turn it into a performance in which the outcome is written before the curtain even rises. The man who stood before them had lived a life of service, of sacrifice, of duty. But none of that mattered in those first moments. All that mattered was what they thought they saw. And what they thought they saw was someone unworthy of respect. What makes this kind of misjudgment so dangerous is that it's rarely corrected in the moment. No one stands up and says, "We're making assumptions." No one raises a hand and says, "Let's examine our bias." Because the moment passes quickly, like a shrug, and then it becomes memory. Unchallenged, it hardens into belief. And that belief, when multiplied across courthouses, police departments, offices, and institutions, builds a culture where people are not just misjudged, but systemically devalued. And over time, that devaluation becomes normalized. It becomes expected. To be misjudged based on appearance is not a momentary insult. It is a lifelong battle for those who experience it again and again. It is the exhausting task of constantly proving that you are more than what they see. It is the burden of carrying your achievements like armor, hoping they are heavy enough to outweigh the prejudice that meets you at the door. The man in the courtroom didn't raise his voice, didn't protest the laughter or the glances. He didn't need to. His identity alone would do that for him, once it was revealed. But until that moment came, he stood under the weight of every wrong assumption, every misread expression, every false narrative that had been placed upon him from the second he walked in. And that is the reality for many, being seen, yet not truly seen at all. It requires a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't feel the need to prove anything to the crowd. It's the kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are, even when the people around you have already made up their minds. In that courtroom, he was being dismissed in real time. People saw only what they chose to see. They didn't recognize the sacrifices he had made, the medals he had earned, the loyalty he had shown to his country. None of that mattered to them, not yet. What mattered to them was their narrative, a simple story they had written in their minds about what a black man in court must be. But he didn't interrupt their narrative with anger or defense. He stood inside it quietly, letting their ignorance echo while his truth remained unshaken. The kind of dignity he carried wasn't taught in classrooms or learned from books. It was built over years of experience, in battlefields where he had risked his life, in command rooms where he had led soldiers, in moments of fear where he had stood firm not just for himself but for others. That inner discipline doesn't leave a person when they walk into a courtroom. It travels with them. And so, while the people in that courtroom saw a man who appeared unremarkable, what they were actually looking at was a man forged by discipline, trained to face pressure without folding, raised to remain calm even when disrespected. His silence wasn't an absence of voice, it was a decision. A deliberate refusal to give his detractors what they wanted. Because what they wanted was a reaction, something they could further mock or reduce. There's something profoundly powerful about not reacting when everyone expects you to. In that moment, he chose self-control over self-defense. That choice forced the room to reveal more about itself than about him. Their laughter, their casual disregard, their shallow judgments, all of it was laid bare against the backdrop of his calm. He became a mirror, showing them their own smallness, without saying a single word. That's the thing about true strength, it doesn't need noise. It doesn't require performance. It doesn't come from the need to convince others. It stands alone, clear, focused, and quiet. His calmness didn't mean he wasn't affected. It didn't mean he didn't notice the way people looked at him, the way they whispered behind their hands, or the way their posture shifted when he walked by. It meant he had chosen to respond with grace, to hold on to his center, and to let the truth speak for itself when the time was right. That kind of restraint is not common. It doesn't come from pride, it comes from deep understanding. He understood that every second he remained composed, he was dismantling their false assumptions, not with anger, but with presence. It's easy to lash out when people laugh at you. It's natural to want to confront disrespect immediately. But in some moments, the greatest statement you can make is no statement at all. To stand in the fire and remain steady. To let those around you expose their bias while you protect your peace. In that courtroom, his calm became a kind of quiet protest, not the kind that draws applause, but the kind that pierces deeper. It made people uncomfortable in a way that words couldn't. Because his calm didn't match their assumptions. His silence didn't fit their expectations. They were looking for a story of weakness, and he gave them a lesson in control. And as the courtroom continued to treat him like a nobody, he waited. Not passively, but with intention. Every moment he stood in silence, he was preparing to show them who he truly was. His calm was not for their benefit, it was for his dignity. He refused to be dragged into the noise. He refused to be reshaped by the ignorance in the room. Instead, he stayed exactly as he was, composed, ready, and unwavering in the face of ridicule. The courtroom, once filled with quiet mockery and the buzz of whispered assumptions, began to shift. The man who had stood at the center of it all, quiet and composed, had just reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document, nothing flashy, no dramatic gesture, no theatrical reveal. But what he held in his hand wasn't just paper. It was truth. It was identity. And as he calmly handed it to the bailiff to be passed to the judge, the energy in the room started to change. The chuckles stopped. The smirks faded. People leaned forward, brows furrowed, curious now in a way they hadn't been just minutes earlier. This wasn't what they were expecting. This wasn't part of the story they had silently written in their minds. They had laughed, assumed, dismissed, but now something was happening that didn't align with those assumptions. The judge looked down at the document, and a subtle, unmistakable change came over his face. His eyes scanned the page, and then slowly lifted to meet the eyes of the man standing before him. The reveal didn't come with a loud declaration. It came with a shift in posture. It came with the quiet clearing of a throat. It came with the sound of silence replacing laughter. Because now, they weren't looking at a nameless black man in the defendant's seat. They were looking at a decorated U.S. Army general. A man who had worn the uniform for decades. A man who had commanded troops, protected lives, and stood for the very ideals the courtroom claimed to represent. The title on that paper, his rank, his service record, the honors attached to his name, did something no argument or raised voice could have done. It shattered the illusion they had created around him. People began to sit up straighter. The same individuals who had rolled their eyes, whispered sarcastic comments, or exchanged knowing looks now wore expressions of discomfort, even embarrassment. The officers in the room adjusted their stance. The snide looks were gone. Some glanced away entirely, suddenly interested in the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but his face. The reveal had not just changed the perception of the man, it had exposed the shallow lens through which they had viewed him. It laid bare the prejudices they had been too comfortable holding on to. And now, they couldn't unsee it. They couldn't pretend they hadn't laughed. They couldn't claim they had always known who he was. Because their behavior, so casual, so confidently judgmental, was rooted entirely in ignorance. The identity reveal wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving a point for the sake of pride. It was a necessary correction to a room that had gotten it all wrong. It was a moment of truth delivered not with vengeance, but with clarity. The man didn't gloat. He didn't throw their prejudice back in their faces. He remained as calm as he had been before, allowing the truth of who he was to speak louder than anything else in the room. That document carried with it decades of discipline, sacrifice, service, and honor. It carried a weight that no amount of courtroom mockery could overshadow. And once it was in the hands of those in power, the narrative shifted entirely. Now, instead of laughter, there was reverence. But it wasn't genuine, not yet. It was reactive, a response to being caught misjudging someone who had proven himself more than worthy of respect. The general didn't need their approval. He had earned his titles long before he ever stepped foot in that courtroom. But the people around him needed to reckon with the fact that they had overlooked greatness because it didn't look the way they expected it to. They needed to understand that they had tried to shrink a man whose achievements stood far taller than their assumptions. The reveal became a moment of reckoning for everyone present. It forced them to confront not just their misjudgment, but the laziness of it, the ease with which they had formed opinions, the speed with which they had written him off, the certainty with which they had believed they were right. Now that certainty was replaced by discomfort. By regret. By a dawning realization that they had participated in something shameful without even realizing it at the time. And the man at the center of it all stood the same way he had before, upright, still, dignified, unshaken. This wasn't just about one man. It was about what his reveal represented. It was a reminder that identity cannot be measured by appearance, that worth is not defined by silence, and that dignity cannot be dismissed simply because it walks into a room without fanfare. It was about how quickly people judge, how easily they laugh, and how stunned they become when the truth outshines their bias. The room that had once buzzed with arrogance was now drenched in humility, all because a piece of paper carried more weight than their assumptions ever could. The silence that followed the identity reveal was unlike the earlier stillness. This silence was weighted, uncomfortable, a reflection of minds processing what had just unfolded. The laughter had vanished, not because someone demanded it stop, but because truth had made it impossible to continue. In those few moments, the courtroom experienced a collective realization, and with it came a subtle but powerful shift in energy. The man who had stood quietly at the center of their assumptions had not changed, only their perception of him had. He had always been a U.S. Army general. He had always earned his place. But now, the room was forced to confront what that said about them, about the ease with which they had turned a decorated veteran into the butt of an unspoken joke. The power in that moment wasn't just about who he was, it was about what he represented. He became more than a single man with a high rank. He became a symbol of every individual who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or reduced because they didn't fit the narrow mold of power that society tends to respect. In a space supposedly built on justice, fairness, and equal treatment under the law, the people in that courtroom had participated in a collective assumption that had nothing to do with facts. And now that the truth had emerged, it exposed how quickly bias can shape behavior before a word is even spoken. The laughter that had once filled the air now felt shameful in hindsight. The officers who had chuckled under their breath were now standing straighter, no longer leaning back with folded arms. The whispers had stopped. There were no more nudges, no more eye rolls, no more casual dismissal. That shift wasn't just out of embarrassment, it was out of the undeniable power of truth forcing people to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. In that instant, the room stopped seeing a defendant and started seeing a leader, a patriot, a man of honor. But the deeper truth is that nothing about the man had changed. Only the lens through which they saw him had. This moment served as a reminder of how perception often dictates respect, and how easily that respect can be misplaced or withheld based on surface-level judgments. The general didn't ask for admiration. He didn't demand respect. He didn't assert his authority with volume or threats. He simply let the facts speak. That, in itself, was a rebuke of the courtroom's initial reaction. It was a demonstration of the very discipline, patience, and strength that had made him a leader in the first place. And now that the courtroom understood who he was, they were no longer in a position of judgment, they were in a position of reflection. That shift wasn't just about individual guilt or awkwardness. It was about reckoning with a deeper societal habit. Too often, people are taught to associate power with a particular image, to give automatic authority to certain appearances while questioning others. This moment shattered that illusion. It forced people to confront the fact that a man they had treated with quiet disdain had led missions, made sacrifices, and protected freedoms, including the very ones that allowed them to sit comfortably in judgment of others. Their silence now wasn't out of respect alone, it was out of the unsettling realization that they had missed something vital, and in doing so, had exposed their own prejudice. The shift from mockery to reverence is not something that happens often in a courtroom. Most cases don't hold a mirror up to those present. But this one did. And in that mirror, they saw their flaws, not as individuals, but as participants in a larger culture that still struggles to recognize dignity when it doesn't come wrapped in familiar packaging. The general had not raised his voice to change the room. His presence did that. His truth did that. And that truth carried a weight that no courtroom laughter could withstand. Now, eyes were lowered not in defiance, but in reflection. Conversations would later be had behind closed doors. People would talk about how they didn't know, how they didn't mean it, how they were surprised. But the deeper lesson was already taught. In that moment, the courtroom learned that real power doesn't need to shout. It stands calmly, silently, with the full weight of truth behind it. And when that truth is finally acknowledged, it doesn't just change the room, it redefines it. The courtroom was no longer a place of mockery. It had become a space where assumptions had been dismantled, where quiet dignity had risen above loud ignorance, and where the presence of one man forced an entire room to see itself more clearly than it ever had before.